Welcome back to another episode of Seaport Vault. My name is Sarah, and today we're climbing into the Wayback Machine, and I think I've gone too far. That's better. All right, today we're climbing into the Wayback Machine to learn a little bit about healthcare on Cruiser Olympia. Let's head in and get started. So here we are on Cruiser Olympia's berth deck. Now, traditionally speaking, the berth deck was the place that the hammocks were hung for sleeping quarters, but it was also a multi-purpose space. So in addition to your sleeping quarters, it'd be where you ate your meals, where you did your laundry, went to the bathroom, and also where the medical facilities were. Now, with Cruiser Olympia, we have a few distinct rooms for all that medical care, and you would be receiving all of that basic care, intensive care, emergency care, as well as dental work and haircuts while you were aboard the ship. So everything that you really needed to have done could be handled on the ship itself. So with that in mind, let's take a walk through this portion of the berth deck to see more of those medical spaces. The first stop on our tour is the dispensary. Now, I like to think of a dispensary as a combination urgent care, doctor's office, and pharmacy, because you could have all of those things done right here in this little room. You could be checked out by the ship's doctor if you had an illness or injury or just needed something looked at, and you could also receive medications that the ship's doctor could provide. Now, let's transition to the next space. So right next door to the dispensary is the surgery room. Now, before 1902, 1903 thereabouts, there wasn't a room that was designated for surgical operations. All of that took place on the berth deck in that multi-purpose space. Now, the area would obviously be cleaned, it would be set up and designated kind of off to the side a little bit, but there wasn't that hardcore designated room where everything would be contained. So with the advent of the surgery room, we had that. Everything could be sterilized in the room and everything would just be taking place in this nice little cluster. Now, in the era that we're talking about in this video and with Olympia in general, the idea of microbes and germs and all that fun stuff was still kind of emerging and still kind of making its way into our day-to-day thoughts. And with that, Olympia's surgeons and Olympia's doctors were always talking about microbes. So, like any human would, the sailors on Olympia started calling the doctors microbes. Now, what happens after your surgery, or if you're recovering from an illness or from an injury? Let's head across the way to find out where those microbes would take you. Welcome to the sick bay. So the sick bay is essentially a recovery room. It's where you would come to recover from an illness, an injury, or a surgery. Now in this space, we have some bunks, and there would also be structured hammocks. So kind of those same hammocks that you would see out in the primary space of the berth deck, but with a little bit more structure to keep you kind of contained and able to just kind of lay comfortably. In the sick bay, we also have a toilet and a bathtub. And the bathtub is not just for hygiene, it was also sometimes used for chemical lice baths if you happen to have those icky little critters on you. Now, keeping all of this in mind, and now that we have all of these basics down with the kind of where we're at, where our space is, let's dive into a few case studies, starting with the Battle of Manila Bay. Let's head up top and learn a little bit more about that. Here we are on the top deck of Cruiser Olympia, and over the course of Seaport Vault thus far, we've actually spent a lot of time up here, but what we haven't done is taken a deep dive into the medical preparation of the Battle of Manila Bay. So let's take a moment to do that right now. Now, the US Navy had not really put in a standardized medical system until July of 1898, and that is a few months after the Battle of Manila Bay. So what happened when there was no standardization? Our junior medical officer tells it for us. In an essay by junior medical officer Dr. Charles P. Kindleberger in 1898, he described this scene. As junior medical officer on the Olympia, my station in battle was in the sick bay situated forward on the berth deck beneath the 8-inch turret, close to the forward ammunition hoist. Before we left Mirs Bay, the men had been instructed in the application of tourniquets and first aid to the injured. At the same time, bandages and tourniquets were distributed to every division. He also goes on to say, instructions were also given in the art of carrying the wounded both by bearers and on stretchers. and orders were passed that all sick and wounded were to be brought at once to the sick bay or to the medical station aft. We began to prepare the sick bay for the coming battle. The battle ports were closed and a canvas screen placed around all the sides and on inboard partitions to protect the surgeons and the wounded from splinters. Our instruments were laid out, ready for operations. Antiseptic solutions, ligatures, tourniquets, stimulants, anesthetics, etc. were placed on a table close by, and the operating table was in position to receive patients. Thankfully, that scene and all that preparation did not really have to be utilized by the sailors on cruiser Olympia. But with all that happening, there was something brewing that was a little bit darker than that. Captain Charles Vernon Gridley, who received those famous orders, "You may fire when ready, Gridley," was suffering from dysentery and what is probably liver cancer at this point in the Battle of Manila Bay, and his health was rapidly declining. Now, he would have been receiving medical attention from the ship's surgeon, the ship's medical officers, but since his health was declining so rapidly after the Battle of Manila Bay, he was transferred to another ship in an attempt to take him home and receive better medical care. But unfortunately, on June 5th, 1898, he passed away stationed in Japan on his way back to the United States. So with the Spanish-American War, disease is still a really huge issue. There were around 300 combat deaths with the Spanish-American War just as a whole, but there were almost 3,000 disease-related deaths, and that is a huge disparity, and a statistic that I think speaks volumes to how big of an issue disease was still at that time. So with that, we're going to start thinking about epidemics and what happened with disease. And to kind of kick that off, looking up here at the main mast, all the way up there is where you would have been put if you contracted smallpox. Now, before we dive into that, let's walk back over to the research center to dive in.
Hey Sarah, how are you? Do you know why seagulls aren't in Delaware Bay? 'Cause they'd be bagels. You like that start? Bagels? You get it? You get it?
Well, I don't know about you, but I definitely need a bagel and cream cheese after that joke. Let's get back to our regularly scheduled programming, shall we? So when you're in a space with about 400 other people, and you're kind of enclosed and breathing in the same air, sharing that same space with everybody day in and day out, germs spread pretty quickly. I mean, if you think of a classroom, if somebody gets sick, everybody else is going to get sick within a few days. So it's really that same kind of concept on a ship. In 1896, smallpox actually went around. However, it only hit 6 people in total, as was evidenced in the book 3 Years Behind the Guns by Lou Tisdale. And he, along with 5 other crew members, contracted smallpox in that year. And while there were options for you to be vaccinated against smallpox, they had opted not to be and contracted the disease. And when it was discovered that they might have it, they were put up in the mainmast to prevent everybody else from getting sick. When they were able to send them off into port, they were put in a tender boat and sent into the port where they were stationed at, and they were able to be treated and everybody was okay. Keeping all of this in mind, it's important to remember that there were some measures in place to keep transmission of disease at a minimum. When ships were going in or out of a port, there were these bills of health that were issued by port officials that went through sanitation, health, and other things aboard a ship. And it was basically a doctor's note that said this ship has this many cases of this disease, and the sanitation levels are either satisfactory or unsatisfactory, and they would be carried with them to the next port to show that they were not transmitting any diseases from the originating port. Let's take a closer look. All right, so this is an example from our archive of a bill of health from 1921 that was issued to cruiser Olympia. And in this document, we go through some basic descriptive information, how many people were aboard the ship, where it was coming from, where it was going. So part of the bill of health is to go through the different diseases that were especially prevalent at the time and list how many cases and how many deaths were associated with it, and then any remarks that the health official wanted to note. So thankfully, in this bill of health, there were no cases reported of any diseases, In some cases on bills of health, they would list when the last case of a disease was. Even if that was a year or two ago, it would still be listed. Smallpox wasn't the only disease to affect the crew of cruiser Olympia. We also had the flu pandemic reach Olympia in 1919. Marvin Keck, a musician aboard cruiser Olympia, kept a daily journal, and this is the 1919 edition of it. He even wrote his name on it here. And this is a daily pocket journal, so it's very small, easy to be kept in a pocket, and it goes through 1 page per day of basically a recording of the day's events. And with that, we get a pretty accurate timeline of what the flu pandemic looked like on cruiser Olympia. In Marvin's diary, he kept track of how many crew members were becoming ill each day, and also who passed away. So our timeline begins on Sunday, February 9th, and we learn that it is a very cold day, and Pat and Irwin, 2 crew members, were sent to the sick bay. And then as we go through the days, we learn that more and more people were becoming ill. We learn of crew members who unfortunately passed away. We grab an accurate snapshot in time of what the flu pandemic looked like while we're aboard cruiser Olympia. And this is a truly invaluable piece of historical literature. Healthcare has made several evolutions through the years thanks to scientific discovery, and the sailors aboard cruiser Olympia were direct beneficiaries of all these advancements. From her commissioning in 1895, when typhoid fever was still really a major concern, through 1922 when she was decommissioned and we were dealing with the after effects of the flu pandemic, there was a lot that was experienced by everyone living in that little chunk of time that I think is really reflective of how resilient and how much of a space Olympia holds in history. Thank you so much for watching today, and I hope you'll join us next time as we uncover more from the Seaport Vault.